Hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Lindsay Newman, and on behalf of the Bay Area Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund, I am delighted to welcome you all to this morning's presentation of the Jews of Color Initiative's Beyond the Count study findings. The Federation is truly honored to be co-hosting this important presentation and following discussion on the experiences of Jews of color. Jews of color are a population that is vital to a vibrant, robust, and resilient Jewish future. It also gives me great pleasure personally to be able to play a role in today's discussion as a communal professional that has been involved in the work of building community with Jews of color for almost 2 decades now. When I started that journey almost 20 years ago, it was often the case that if Jews of color wanted to engage in Jewish community where they felt seen and authentically supported, very often we had to build what we needed. We often found ourselves in the midst of a Jewish communal establishment that offered few to no options for space built by and for Jews of color. So in the years since, I am very pleased that we have seen the growth of organizations, projects, and initiatives that seek to fill that gap. And I am excited that today we will hear crucial research from Jews of Color Initiative, an organization that fills an important need, lifting up the experiences of Jews of color and encouraging organizations to respond to their needs. Here at Federation, we have begun the process of doing just that. One of the great pleasures of my time thus far on the board of Federation has been to serve as chair of the Federation's Racial Justice Task Force, a group that was convened 2 years ago with an original goal to bring Jews of color to the table to help chart Federation's course to become a more racially equitable organization. In those 2 years, our task force has benefited from the wisdom and dedication of a racially diverse group of lay leaders, and we have especially benefited from the professional and lived experiences of Jews of color in influencing priorities, setting goals, and innovating change. All of this work is done on a foundation of partnership and relationship. And so I want to recognize our collaborators and allies in this work, including Federation Board Chair Arthur Slepian, who has played a crucial role in championing and prioritizing the work of the committee, as well as Federation CEO Joyce Sisiski and Director of Collaborative Philanthropy Danielle Mashorer, whose tireless work has truly been pivotal in helping to drive change. Because in the end, we know that racial justice is truly critical to achieving Federation's mission to shape diverse and dynamic Bay Area Jewish communities, where people find a meaningful connection to Judaism and to each other. With this work, we've been able to touch more people across the organization, and we know in order to continue to be successful, we will need to impact more people and more organizations across the entire community. James Baldwin once said, "Know from whence you came. If you know whence you came, there are absolutely no limitations to where you can go." So today's event is a crucial part of that process, allowing us to learn more about who we are and where our journey of creating a community that centers equity and belonging for all will take us. And so it is with great joy and appreciation that I pass the mic to Arya Marvazi of the Jews of Color Initiative so that we can get started.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for your words. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today in the flesh in the Bay Area, and to everyone out there in Zoom land, virtually across the nation. We're so grateful to be together. I am Arya Marvazi. I am the Senior Director of Programs here at the Jews of Color Initiative. And as a self-proclaimed nonprofit Jewish communal lifer, it is a privilege and honor to stand before you representing our organization. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this is just a very exciting and pivotal moment, it feels. Over the last decade, our Jewish community has experienced, as Lindsay mentioned, a seismic shift in the way that Jewish people of color have been seen, counted, embraced, and empowered in our communal ecosystem. And just 5 years ago, the establishment of the Jews of Color Initiative, with its 3 foci of grant-making and field building, community education, and research, which you'll engage with momentarily, became vital to this transformational shift, a shift that we'd argue carries the full vibrancy and future of Jewish life within it. It's worthy of note that over 50 community members within our over 200 registered for today identify as Jews of color, and this is precisely the type of representation we hope to see someday replicated in Jewish life across the nation. As an individual, a Jewish communal professional, and a proud Jew of color, I express the most sincere gratitude to the funders who have supported us and continue to empower this imperative work, and to the Jewish leaders of color, many of whom are in this room, who have against many odds found paths to education, equity, prayer, and power in Jewish life. Which so perfectly brings me to Ilana Kaufman, and I will be brief to save getting mushy. Ilana, as our visionary founder and executive director at the initiative, you have opened doors and laid a foundation for a future that we hope very soon will see Jews of color represented in all facets of Jewish life. Your inspiring intellect, passion for pedagogy, and commitment to community has moved mountains for Jews of color and all of Jewish peoplehood. And the research you share continues to do that every day. A brief housekeeping note for all of us as we listen, whether in the room or virtually. For those online, please feel free to post your questions in the Zoom chat. Our team, both virtually and in the room, are going to be consolidating themes so that we can pass them up to Ilana for our Q&A portion. And to those in the room, please feel free to use those note cards and pens to write your questions. You can casually pass them up to Gabby, who will be sitting in front, or we'll do that when we get to the Q&A portion. And thank you so much again for the time, energy, and investment to bring this opportunity to life together. Without further ado, here is Ilana Kaufman with Beyond the Count.
Okay. Good morning. Hello out there, everyone on Zoom. Let me settle my glitter a little bit. I'm a little bit nervous, which is a good thing. And I'm really just happy to be here and see everybody. And I want to thank the Federation. I was in this building for 4 years as a staffer with the JCRC. My first role in philanthropy was as a program officer at the San Francisco Federation Endowment Fund. And who would have thunk that training would have been vital for me to be able to have the skills and the tools and the capacities to even think about imagining an organization that made grants and focused on research and was able to participate in the extent to which we are in the community. And so I appreciate being back. Sometimes I talk too fast. And so if I talk too fast, somebody flag me and I'll try to slow down. And then I also just want to do a personal shout out. My team knows yesterday that when we were going over the registration list for who was on Zoom out there, Notorious KNIT, who's like this famous, amazing knitter, who I follow on Instagram, is part of our audience today, and I kind of freaked out a little bit in the office and had a total fangirl moment. And so Notorious KNIT, if you're out there, I'm totally thrilled that you're here, and thank you for joining us. I wasn't sure I was going to do it, but I got some encouragement, so anyway. So today is not a presentation. Today we're teaching and learning together. And so I want to ground us all in the fact that we're not here to entertain each other, but we're here to work together, okay? And so we're going to talk about data. We're going to grapple with data. I want you to take notes. I want you to have questions. I want to invite you to push back. And I want to invite you, as we begin, to really, really, really focus on what this content has to do with you. We're going to try to get through in the next 37 minutes why we commissioned the study, some essential questions to guide how you're thinking about and engaging in the work today. I'll talk about the methodology. We'll get into the data. We're going to talk about all the juicy things like the term Jews of color, the term white Jews, and then we'll end by doing a strategic revisiting of the essential questions that I'm going to frame up in just a second. And my ask of you is that you are not passive in today's process, and that whatever your learning style is and however you approach your work, that you engage with some physics, and that your activity today is a verb, that we are all verbs today and not nouns. And the other thing I want to say is we're not going to get through all the data today. There are 38 pages of data that, like, from my perspective, if you're into data, you should be curling up with a cup of tea or a glass of wine and a little crackling fire. And just like cozying with these 38 pages of study. We'll get through what we can, and that's gonna be enough for today. I want you to think about who you are in the data, who you are as a player. Are you a leader? Are you a JOC participant? Are you both? If you're a white communal leader out there, there's a lot of information in there that we're gonna talk about, and we're gonna talk about leadership today and some of the shortcomings and failings of leadership regardless of racial background in the Jewish community. I want you to figure out how this data informs your practice and your policies and what immediately you can do to activate your learnings as part of the experience of engaging with the data. And we're gonna end today asking again about how you can be held accountable. We're gonna end today asking again about how you can be held accountable as a leader to the work and how you can ensure Jews of color are part of your accountability process. So why did the JOCI, the Jews of Color Initiative Commission, be on the count? So in general, I think we have one of the best jobs ever, which is we get to listen to the questions of the Jewish community and then try to answer them. And the Jews of Color Initiative first did counting inconsistencies, which helped develop a sense of the demographics of Jews of color in the United States. And after we presented counting inconsistencies, the next set of questions sounded something like, but what are the experiences of Jews of color? What are the perspectives of Jews of color? What are the beliefs of Jews of color? How do we understand Jews of color within a communal context? The problem with that question is it doesn't center Jews of color. And so then we had to shift and add more questions to the process, which is what's important to Jews of color in this study and in the data to answer so that we can be further rooted in the communal ecosystem. And so in terms of why we commissioned this, we're trying to answer the question for all of us. And we're trying to be very sensitive to not answer the question through a white gaze, answering questions for white people, but for the community. We commissioned this to respond to the questions out there so that we had real data and real answers. And we wanted to be able to provide insights into the community and tools into the community, recognizing this is not the end-all be-all for JOC data. It's a starting point, and it's a component of the data. And the question is, how is it meaningful? And what else do you need to do to add more meaning to it? Or to extend your learnings to a broader context? Because of course, all data has its limitations. This is the largest study of Jews of color in United States history, maybe the world, we don't know. But we had 1,118 qualified participants for the study. Qualified meaning you chose, you engaged, one engaged. They clicked all the right boxes for the screener questions, and then they landed into the survey itself. In addition to the over 1,000 respondents to the survey, we had over 60 in-depth interviews with Jews of color, both before and after the survey. The JOC leaders before the survey helped us set up the survey, and then there were all these learnings from the survey afterwards that we had to go back and ask more questions of Jews of color to help us understand the findings. And so that's why we had the 61 interviews. And let me say one other thing that's really important. This is not a representative study. It's a non-probability study. It's a snowball study, which means a little JOCI pushed a snowball down the hill saying, Jews of color out there, where are you? Please respond to our survey. And then it created a network of responses. You'll see in a minute that we covered 47 states with our survey. And so while it's not representative, it's certainly reflective of the demographics of the United States. And if we can find all these Jews of color out there, imagine what a bigger shop could do and the profound amount of data we could gather and the meaning we could make in the understanding with a broader study. The other things that's really important to know is very intentionally, our work was designed and informed by critical race theory, feminist pedagogy and theory, equity pedagogy. We have a perspective of critical race theory, racism is real. And so those are all just foundation concepts to inform the quality of the study and the quantity of the study, but there's a very specific point of view that informs how we shaped this study. Okay, let's talk a little bit about using the term Jews of color. We're very clear that the term Jews of color, first of all, presupposes that race is real. It presupposes that you are of color in context to whiteness. And so there's a whole dynamic in relation to whiteness. It presupposes that one little box can somehow brilliantly include all people who are experiencing race and racism in a context of the Jewish community, even though race is fluid. In terms of this study, first of all, everyone self-selects, self-identifies in terms of identifying as a person of color or Jew of color. So everybody who participated in the study self-selects to identify as such. We also appreciate that the term Jews of color is imperfect, and so we use it as a conceptual framework to inform the work. And then from there, we understand that race is fluid, racism is real, and it will evolve and grow in different ways over time, and we have to have an inquiry posture to understand how race and racism affect the Jewish community. But we know it's an imperfect term. Not every person of color who is Jewish self-identifies as a Jew of color, and we have to just be able to hold all of that in this kind of conversation. The other part of that, of course, because it's an algorithm, is that if we're talking about Jews of color, we're also presupposing that whiteness is real. And so in the context of this work, and in the context of the United States, we have a point of view, we believe that whiteness is real. And while I understand that, for example, before the GI Bill, to put a mark in the sand, I understand that before the GI Bill, for example, Jews of European background, people from Italy, people from Armenia, people from Greece, had a category of other in the United States, technically and historically. And there are moments in the United States where people of backgrounds who are not Black, brown, Asian, Native, Latinx have had the opportunity to reach for tools of upward mobility. And for the Jewish community, the GI Bill was one such moment where Jews were offered an opportunity for mobility, and Black and brown folks in the military were not offered that same opportunity. And those are tools of mobility into sort of the trappings of whiteness, the privilege of whiteness, the benefits that come with whiteness. And they also separate out people across races in the United States, and those who feel the headwinds of racism have fewer opportunities than those who don't. We also understand that for many Jews of European background, the privilege of whiteness is conditional. And so in one setting, one might have an opportunity for privilege, and in another setting, that same individual might be targeted for their Jewish identity. And so that conditionality is complicated, it creates a lot of vulnerability, but it doesn't make one a person of color in the United States' socio-political context. I've said enough on that. I'm sure take down questions. If you have feelings, if you want to make notes, please do. So let's get into the data, shall we? Okay. First, we had representatives participate in the study in all but 3 states, Wyoming, North Dakota, and Mississippi. You can see right here, California is totally overrepresented in the data, but this is good because it helps you make sense of your own regional context. The East was also overrepresented, but you see a huge representation from Texas, for example. We have lots of people up here in the state of Washington. And so if you have questions about where Jews of color in the United States, they're everywhere, we're everywhere. We even had folks from Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Alaska. This doesn't mean that there are no Jews of color in these 3 states. It means we were not able to find them. So who responded to the data? 52% of the respondents self-identify as being in their 20s and 30s. A majority of the respondents self-identify as women, which reflects the demographics in the Jewish professional space and in the ecosystem, and so this is not newsworthy, but it's important to track in terms of the experiences and who's in the leadership roles and who's in the professional spaces. Respondents are highly educated. There's this myth in the United States that people of color are lesser formally educated than white folks. According to our data, 80% completed college, 49% of the Jews of color in the data completed all or some of a postgraduate or professional degree. So when folks say, like, we're looking for Jews of color to be on our staff, but there just aren't any with the right training, the right credentials, the data doesn't really support that. It's also important to note, 14% of our respondents self-identify as being disabled or differently abled. And so what does that mean about access? What does it mean about inclusion? What does it mean about creating a space where everybody can enter physically, metaphorically, spiritually? Let's talk about race. 235 participants, 21% self-identify as Black or African American, 11% Latinx, 10% Asian, Asian American, 7% Middle Eastern or North African, 1%, 12 respondents also self-identified as white. And so you were not screened out if you identify as a person of color who also identifies as white. And so you have, and you'll see as we scoot down this list, 36% of the respondents self-identify as 2 or more races, 9% as 3 or more races. That's almost 500 respondents. And so in a context where at one point it didn't matter if a person of color had white in them, because they were still fully seen as a person of color, you're seeing an evolution of articulation where some people of color also can identify with their whiteness. And so I think it's super interesting that we have these data points. I want to just underscore the last point I made. About 500 participants self-identify as having 2 or more or 3 or more races. This maps directly onto what we know about demographics in the United States. And it creates an important question. I'm not going to use the word tension, but in a context where we haven't really dealt with our Black and brown racism, how do you also make space for the reality that the majority of people of color in our space are and will continue to be multiracial? And that's just complicated, and it's something it's really worth paying attention to. Let's talk about ethnicity. I once had somebody send us an email at the Jews of Color Initiative applying for a job, and they said, "I wonder if you will consider for me for a job because I am Ashkenazi." And it was a code for saying I am white, but 42% of our respondents are also Ashkenazi. 9% self-identify as Sephardi, 42% is 4%, 42 participants is Mizrahi. We also have community members, colleagues who are from Beta Israel community, B'nai Israel, and further, and then people who identify as more than one Jewish ethnicity. Right? And so in our communal spaces that are so hardline Ashkenazi or so hardline Mizrahi or Sephardi in terms of separation, like where you want to daven, like are you this, are you this, are you this? What happens again in a context where people are all of this? And how do we make space for people to be Jewish instead of Ashkenazi Jewish or Mizrahi or Sephardi? Wait, did I miss something on that slide? Oh. As you're sort of sitting with and starting to kind of marinate in this data, 85% of the respondents identify with Judaism being a culture, 82% a people, 73% a religion, 48% an ethnicity, which just further complicates the conversation about if you're trying to like have a conversation about race. Are you having a conversation about ethnicity? Are you having a conversation about culture? Are you having a conversation about all of them, right? When are you not having a conversation about all of them? Okay, so there's this habit in the Jewish community, and I think particularly, like we have a history of assuming that people of color in a context where we've assumed all Jews are white for so long, then we assume people of color who are Jewish must have come into Judaism in some particular way. Like you couldn't have been natively part of the Jewish community. You must have come in through a pathway. What was your pathway to Judaism? What was your pathway to Jewish life? How did you become Jewish? Pretty much every Jew of color I know has been asked, how did you become Jewish? When did you become Jewish? Well, 49% of the respondents were raised Jewish or another 16% raised Jewish in something else. So again, while the data is not technically representative, it's reflective of the fact that more than half of the Jews of color were raised Jewish. 39%, their mother's Jewish, 37% father's Jewish, 28% spouse or partner's Jewish. 22% of Jews of color have 2 Jewish parents. Another 42% have 1 Jewish parent. So the majority of Jews of color in this data set have Jewish parents. So this idea, again, that Jews of color somehow come into Jewish life versus come out of Jewish life, again, is not true. So then let's talk about what happens. Let's talk about Jews of color in Jewish life. Okay, let me set up this slide for you. The big question is respondents participated in a wide variety of Jewish activities and organizations. For those of you who also read Pew, a portrait of Jewish Americans that came out 2 weeks before Beyond the Count, this slide will feel a little pewy to you. And if you were going to compare data points, you could extract sort of comparable data from this slide and a Pew slide, and if anybody else wants to talk about that, let me know. So first of all, this idea that Jews of color don't have training in traditional Jewish life. This idea that Jews of color don't have like all the experiences. You know, when people talk about like what camp did you go to? Jews of color went to camp. Jews of color, majority of which we have formal training, formal Jewish education. Most Jews of color participate in synagogue or Jewish communal life in a house of worship. Many Jews of color participated in Jewish youth groups. Many Jews of color went to Jewish overnight camp. Many Jews of color traveled to Israel. And so the question of kind of like where do Jews of color participate in Jewish life and all the traditional spaces Jews of color and Jews have to participate. The question is, if you don't see us, why is that? Or if we no longer participate, why is that? And we'll talk about that. Okay, this is an important slide. The theme is Jewishness is most connected to a sense of justice and connection with the past and future. That's the big meta context and concept. And the question respondents are asking are expressions of Jewish identity that are very important to the respondent. Again, for my Pew people out there, this is another slide we could play with. I liken it to kind of like comparing crab apples and pears, like not totally the same, but in the same genus of fruit. The 5 most important areas of Jewish life for Jews of color are 1, working for justice and equity, 2, passing on Jewish identity to the next generation, 3, honoring our parents, grandparents, and ancestors, remembering the Holocaust, and celebrating Jewish holidays. What's amazing about this data is every one of these 5 activities requires formal Jewish training, formal Jewish content knowledge, and the actual commitment to living a Jewish life. And what I mean by that is lador vador, honoring our parents, grandparents, from generation to generation. You have to know what that is. You have to know what that means, and you have to know how to pass something on, and you have to have something to pass on. It requires formal skills, formal tools, formal training. I want to talk about remembering the Holocaust. It doesn't say remembering genocides, okay? It says remembering the Holocaust. And in this context, 65% of Jews of color feel like this is very important. My question to white colleagues out there is how many of you feel like remembering the genocides of the diversity of Jews of color and our histories? Because many Jews of color come from countries, life experiences, where they have also experienced genocide. But how important is it to white Jews to honor all of the genocides that the Jewish people have experienced? And how profound is it within a context where Jews of color experience tremendous racist headwinds, and we're going to talk about that in a second, we still have the capacity, 65% of us still have the capacity to honor a very specific genocide experience that may or may not have anything to do with their cultural, racial, or ethnic background. I think it's very deep. I think it's very deep. I also want to just let you scan your eyes down to the 4th from the bottom. 32% of Jews of color feel like caring about Israel is very important, okay? If you were to ask me, how does this number compare to white Jews? Anybody who wants to get into the data, tell me. The number in Pew is a few percentage points lower for finding caring about Israel very important for the same age and stage set for among all Jews in general. And so the data tells us that Jews of color, at least as much, if not more, care about Israel. So this idea that somehow Jews of color are more anti-Zionist or more pro-BDS than white Jews is just not true. It's just not true. Okay. Which experiences feel less important? 18% said caring about Israel. 12% said wearing Jewish symbols. 12% said engaging in prayer. 7% said speaking in a language and that the ellipses take you to Hebrew. and 6% say honoring Shabbat. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, you've got a sense of demographics. You've got a sense of like the diversity of who we're talking about. You've got a sense of our training, our context. So what happens to Jews of color when we're in communal spaces? Okay, so let me frame up this slide for you. It is more difficult for identities to coexist in predominantly white spaces than in BIPOC spaces. Black, Indigenous, People of Color, for those of you who are not familiar with that acronym. So it's this burden of being able to hold, it's either a burden or a gift depending on the environment you're in, to being able to hold and just be in our multiple identities all of the time. And everyone out there, either in this room or on Zoom, has an experience of which part of us do we need to check at the door when we walk into various spaces, whether that's your gender identity, your racial identity, religious, sexual orientation, what have you. For Jews of color, it is usually or often difficult for our multiple identities to exist in predominantly white Jewish spaces. And so when you think about it, almost every space in the US Jewish communal ecosystem is a predominantly white environment, institution, or an organization. And I don't say that with any heat or any passion behind it. Like, that's just kind of a demographic statement. And so we have to assume that for most Jews of color, it's going to be difficult to be whole in most Jewish spaces across the United States. And what does that mean for leaders who are holding those spaces and building those spaces? It's also hard for us to be whole in predominantly people of color spaces, BIPOC spaces, right? Because we don't know the environment, what it's going to be like in terms of our Jewish identity and the expectations of us as people of color, the expectations of us as Jews, and then the expectations of us just as humans, like just doing what we want to do and being ourselves. It becomes less hard when we're with our families and in relationships with the Jewish community. And why I want to flag that is in those environments, they're neither predominantly white nor predominantly BIPOC. Our families, our kind of tribal spaces, our communal spaces are just multiracial, are just multigender, are just multi-faith, are just diverse like that. And so there's not a goal, right, of having this data then say, like, we need to have only BIPOC spaces. We can talk about that in a minute. But we need to understand that in the environments that are multiracial and really established and developed that way, they also lean toward being anti-racist. And that's where people can thrive, is at the intersection of a diverse environment and in a space where the ethos is one of racial equity and justice. And that ethos is lived and practiced as real. Okay, the header on this is most Jews of color have a wide range of negative experiences in Jewish communal settings. So colleagues out there, organizational leaders out there, that's us, right? Like, these are our spaces that we are responsible for. 75% of Jews of color either agree or strongly disagree that when we are in spaces of Jewish communal settings, that people make assumptions about us based on our skin tone. The minute we walk in the door, people evaluate us, they size us up, and conjecture about who we are, what we do, why we're supposed to be there. Before this role, I had a different role in the Jewish community, and I went to do a site visit somewhere, and I got there, and the colleague, I had not met them before in person, and they looked at me up and down, and they said, I expected you to be shorter and white. And I said, I expected you not to greet me that way. But like, sometimes it's like shocking for people because they have been not told the truth about the Jewish community, that when we show up, we defy their expectation and reality to the point where they have to just blurt something awkward out because we defy what they've been told is real, right? And I'm sorry, and I feel bad. And I want to like create a pedagogical and content charge to the leaders, teachers, the people who are responsible for creating those environments of knowledge, because we have not trained our people to know the truth. And it puts us all at a deficit because we might not recognize each other out there, right? Like if we have trained ourselves to not know that we are seeing Jewish people in our spaces, that's a problem. 74% of Jews of color have felt burdened by explaining ourselves and our identity. How did you become Jewish? Why is your Hebrew so good? Like, which one of your parents is Jewish? It's exhausting. 66% of Jews of color have been asked questions about our race that make us feel uncomfortable. 63% of Jews of color have experienced stress due to being the only one. And you have to assume if you are in relationship with a Jewish communal professional, somewhere they are the only one. You have to know that when you're sending out your colleagues to work, that they're going to experience racism out there by virtue of existing. Because they're going to be an only one, and the people who they're working with may not know they exist, conceptually. Or may not know they went to Jewish camp, or may not know that they love Israel. 60% have felt tokenized, and 58% of Jews of color feel like we are treated as if we don't belong. And these are our spaces. These are our communal spaces. Okay, the headline is, most Jews of color have experienced discrimination in Jewish communal settings. The dark green is discrimination because of race. The medium green is discrimination because of how we became Jewish, and the light green is because of another aspect of our identity. 54% of Jews of color have experienced discrimination in synagogue, in shul, like in the places we're supposed to be able to go daven. Full stop. 1 in 2 Jews of color experience racism at shul. Totally unacceptable. 33% of Jews of color have experienced racism in just a regular Jewish organizational life. 30% in a Jewish school or educational center. So like if you go to Jewish day school and you got to go to shul, that's a real setup if those environments are not integrated in the very traditional sense of the word, both in terms of racial diversity and spiritual understanding. 24% of Jews of color have experienced racism in other settings, and 4% have experienced racism or discrimination in environments that are related to Jews of color. And so we who work in JOC spaces, Jews of color spaces, have to be very, very careful not to replicate the trappings of power and privilege in ways that perpetuate versus interrupt the racism and the discrimination. Okay. Most people who've heard me talk about Beyond the Count know this is my favorite slide. And it's obviously the most complicated one, and it really appeals to me, and here's why. Okay, let me frame it up. Jewish leaders are inadequately addressing racism and white supremacy within the American Jewish community. Okay? So it's rating, it's scaling to what extent leaders are effective in their work. Okay? 65% of Jews of color feel that Jewish communal leaders are either poorly or very poorly meeting the needs of Jewish people of color in Jewish communal organizations. Full stop. Right? Like it's alarming. 66% of Jews of color feel that the leaders are inadequately addressing the needs for greater racial and ethnic diversity in Jewish organizational leadership. How can it be that we have thousands of Jewish communal organizations across the country in our communal ecosystem, and there are fewer than 20 CEOs, EDs, senior leaders who are Jewish people of color across thousands of communal organizations? How can that be? How can it be in 2022? And close your eyes. What if those statistics were about men and women? How would we ever let this be acceptable? Like, what about racism does not shock us into action in ways that other identities do? Okay, let's keep going. 60% of Jews of color believe Jewish communal leaders are inadequately addressing racism and white supremacy within the American Jewish community. 60% of Jews of color think that we leaders are doing an inadequate job of addressing racism inside the Jewish community, what slays me is this number gets better when it talks about addressing racism outside the Jewish community. So there's a slight percentage increase about how well leaders are dealing with racism outside the community. That is very deep. It is very deep. Okay, let's bring it home. This slide, the header is respondents reported feeling a greater sense of connection with other JOC than with white Jews. And what you have is a scale. And just like you're thinking, the closer the circle is, the more in relationship we are. And as we go down the scale, more distance is created between Jews of color and others. So let's talk about this context. And remember I said earlier our families are multiracial, and that's where many Jews of color can just be and be whole. Jews of color feel most connected when we are with our families. And our families are largely multiracial. To remind the community out there, across the United States, the data tells us something like 1 in 5 Jewish families self-identify as multiracial, 20% across the United States. If you're talking about the coast, that number goes up to 1 in 4, 25%. Okay, so the other piece is like this idea of us being kind of all white, traditional heterosexual families, kind of this whole construct, it's antiquated and not real. And so if we are holding that space for this kind of rarefied version of the Jewish family, we're actually not addressing the reality of the Jewish diversity out there. And we're not at all institutionalizing the capacity to embrace the diversity that we have and the diversity that's going to come. Because if we think it's complicated now, it's only going to get more complicated in terms of identity. And so the idea is not how do we maintain what we have, because you're maintaining an artifact. The question is how do you leverage what you have built and expand it for the capacity to be of the future. And to just create a little finer point on that, we are not creating a future where we're like, we're gonna have this many people of color and this many queer people and this many whatever. We are creating a future where we have the capacity to be elastic around who shows up. Because what's going to happen is we can't imagine, our minds are too small for who's gonna show up 20 years from now. But our minds are big enough to know our minds are too small, and we're not gonna recognize that Jew in 20 years from now. We have to have some comfort with that and hang tight to what it means to be Jewish. As you move down this line, there's more distance for us as Jews of color when Jews of color are with JOC organizations. So it's not even like being in a JOC organization is like the panacea, right? It's just like not as bad, right? And it makes us feel more whole and more comfortable. There's more distance when Jews of color are with Jews of any race. And then the distance gets very intense when Jews of color are with only white Jews and in predominantly white organizations. And so the least kind of safe space for the whole Jewish community, because it's a risk if we don't create something that's tight, integrated, whole, in relationship, in community, predominantly white spaces where there really is no racial diversity, we have to understand through a data perspective, is the least hospitable place then for all Jews. Because that also means your multiracial families are not comfortable there. Your white parents of kids of color, your white partner of another person of color. We have to understand that predominantly white spaces are not safe or hospitable for them too. Because they're coming and sussing it out and looking for, is it gonna be safe for my family? Is it gonna be safe for me as somebody who's deeply in relationship with people of color? And so in that way, it's about Jewish families. And I say that kind of in the most expansive way, it's not about Jews of color. All right, and so let's go back to where we started, which is this. Take a minute to dial in the most intimate way who you are in this data. And you can be many people. Like me, I'm a participant. I didn't actually fill out the survey. I couldn't do that. But I'm both a person of color who experiences racism every day in this community. I'm also an organizational leader and a community leader who understands the power of perpetuating racism as part of this community. But you've got to be real about who you are in this role. And you got to be real about the power you have, and particularly for my white colleagues out there in leadership roles of power and influence and resource allocation, like, it's on you. Like, there is nobody else. Like, I'm the only JOC fund leader in the country in the Jewish communal space, right? So there's not another one of me who's going to help. So it really is up to you. And for white leadership, my question for you is, like, what's in it for you? Because if you haven't been compelled yet by hearing from Jews of color, by reading the data, what has to happen for us to be just like shaken into action? And what's the cost if we're not shaken into action? What findings in here must inform your practice, must inform your policies, must inform how you do resource allocations and grant making, or whatever it is that whatever resource you share out there, right? Like, if your organization or your leadership has neglected to tend to and understand and work on behalf of a diverse Jewish community, then you have an equity position that you need to take on. And you have to catch up, right? Like, you have to catch up. If you spent the first 100 years not tending to Jews of color, then we have to catch up. And again, it's only on us. There's nobody else. There's nobody else who's going to swoop in and make our environment less racist. There's nobody who's going to swoop in and do this for us. It's us. And how lucky are we? What's your professional and personal obligation to the data? Right? Like, the data is here, and the data is real. And so what is your obligation to the data? You've asked for it. You've delivered it. It's potent. It's also really reassuring. Like, you should have a whole fleet of JOC colleagues in your space if you want to hire folks and they want to be in your shop, because we're highly educated, we're well-trained, we're steeped in Jewish life, and we've done all of this while experiencing the headwinds of racism. Like, imagine what we could do if we weren't dealing with racism too, right? Like, imagine how much more energy we might have, how much more creative space we might have, right? Imagine how we might connect with text and Torah if we actually could get to shul and not be racially profiled on the way in. Like, just imagine. And then lastly, how are you holding yourself accountable, your organization accountable, your leadership accountable, your staff accountable to this work? Not like I'm going to do a check-in on how I'm doing, but like, literally, what accountability measures are you institutionalizing in your work to ensure that you set goals, that you have standards, and then your progress is measured against those goals and standards? And how are you making sure JOC are informing that? Right? If Jews of color are not informing your accountability standards, you are not really in a position to make those accountability standards because you're missing your vital partners out there. I've said a lot. Thank you for all of your attention, and we're going to take the next 15, 16, 17 minutes or so to answer some questions. And so take a breath, take a quick stretch if you want. For my friends on Zoom out there, I can't see you. I'm sorry I can't see you. I miss you. But take a stretch, and let's see here. So one question I want to, and these are questions that you sent in on Zoom. Thank you to Gabby, our senior program officer. These are questions that came in on Zoom and also from this group. What are the most important issues of expression of Jewish identity and the politics among JOC? So I'll start with the second clause, which is around politics of JOC. I don't know. And why I'm saying that is the politics among Jews of color are as diverse as the politics among Jews, are as diverse among the politics of everybody. And so I want to do like a little special sensitivity note on that, which is, it is often assumed because we are people of color, our politics are different than white people. They might be, don't get me wrong, but that assumption has to be tested. And I want to encourage everybody to wonder what more we have in common than how different we are than white people, right? Like, I think what we all share is that we don't want white supremacists to come and kill us. Like, let's just be very real. I think what we all share is that this 8.7% inflation increase, or whatever it's going to be, doesn't harm our families. Does it make it impossible for us to pay our staffs a living wage? Right? Like, I think what we all care about is preserving democracy. And if we can't figure out how to come together around those themes, none of this matters, because we won't be here. Right? So the question is, how can we stop being so racist so the Jewish community come together so we can save ourselves? And I want to remind everybody, Jews are just 2% of the US population. And so we don't do this just for ourselves. We do this because we need to be in community with everybody else who's trying to survive too. The most important issues we've talked about, right? Access to Jewish life, not experiencing racism, people not making assumptions about us, people not tokenizing us, being in spaces that are multiracial, being in spaces that are not informed by racism, but more importantly, are intentionally informed by anti-racism. And that's not just good for the Jews, that's good for everybody. So there's a question here about if we've noticed the differences in the Bay Area JOC experience in the Jewish community compared with other regions. Let's wait for the panel to talk about that. So I just want to we have a great group of colleagues and specialists, and you don't need me on that one. How do you recognize going beyond inclusion without tokenizing JOCs, Jews of color, in programs, events, and communities? I love this question. Thank you for whoever asked it. So first I want to give you a little way to filter whether or not you're tokenizing people, just like an easy kind of reach for. Very often, particularly in environments that are not yet diverse, we reach for the first person of color we know to join the task force, to have a conversation to inform how racist our environment really is. And we usually reach for somebody who we know, and in that situation, you want to test whether or not we want to talk about these issues. But you're going to have an opportunity with people you know to have them be as bridges. And many Jews of color who are intentionally in Jewish communal spaces choose to serve as a bridge, and to choose to serve to be in relationship to kind of help people assess and understand the environment. In that case, you want to ask somebody if it's okay to request their assistance. You may want to pay them as a consultant if they're expert in this work. And if you're just reaching for somebody because they are a person of color, but you're not reaching for them because of their expertise, that's a quick filter for tokenizing, right? And so for me, and the colleagues know this, I don't want to be on any sort of group situation where we're just talking about racial diversity. If you're reaching for me because I have skills with audits, and for those of you who know me, I sit on some boards and I'm on the audit task force because I love audits. When you reach for me and ask for me to join your audit committee, I feel seen, right? I feel known. I feel validated. And I'm going to bring my whole perspective as a Jewish person of color, right? That comes with it. But when you reach for one of my areas of expertise, I know you're not tokenizing me because you need me for an actual skill. If you're reaching for somebody without any clarity about their expertise, their training, and their talent, and you're just reaching for them because you know they're a great person and they're also a Jewish person of color, it's not enough. And that's a quick way to know if you're tokenizing. And so my recommendation is don't ask for people to join you just because they are a person of color. Refrain. Push yourself further and do more work and make a list of who do I know who has this skill and this expertise, who I'm in relationship with, who may or may not give me their time. And start the conversation there. And then once you're in conversation, you might ask, how does your perspective on audit, Ilana, change as a person of color? And I might talk about various equity issues in the auditing system. But if you're just reaching for somebody because they're a POC, that's a quick indication that you're tokenizing them. How does the data differ based on generations, especially as it relates to involvement in community institutions, synagogues, etc.? This data disproportionately weighted toward people in their 30s-ish, and their 20s and 30s, mid-30s. And so first I want to say the data is skewed, and we know that because it's not representative. What we know, though, is that in the communal space, there's a disproportionate representation who have access to participation, who are in their 20s and 30s. I've had the privilege of meeting many people in their 50s, 60s, and some of the folks in their 70s who responded to this survey. Their perspective is, and I can't speak for all of them, but I'm going to give you some little anecdotal nuggets. I was in Washington, D.C. presenting the data, and there was a Jews of Color dinner beforehand, and two people walked in their 70s and 80s, a couple. And they sat down at the table, and they looked at the group, and of course we all looked at them, and they said, there are pictures on the wall in the hallway of our children who have been bar bat mitzvahed in this synagogue. And you can see they're the only people of color on all the pictures in the hallway. And many synagogues have this hall of pictures where it's like all the B'nai Mitzvah classes. They said, we've waited 20 years to come into a room and not be the only ones. And so for many Jews of color, and we see this in the data, we've just embraced the idea that we would be an only one. And we've embraced it to the point where we have made the decision to move through these spaces as an only one, with all of the burdens, misunderstandings, isolation, and loneliness, just to be in Jewish community. Just to be in Jewish community. What's different and what you see in the data from our colleagues who are in their 20s and 30s is it's not enough just to be in Jewish community. It's not enough just to be tolerated. It's not enough just to be welcomed. It's not even enough just to be told you belong versus feeling like you belong. And you will not be able to know your community belongs if there's an only one, if you've not done rigorous work around diversity, inclusion, equity, justice. Those are basic underpinnings of holding a diverse community. And so the other pieces for the young people out there, keep rattling the cages. Absolutely do not stop at I will be tolerated, right? Don't step down and make yourself small to make the white colleagues feel comfortable. That's the burden of my generation. That's been my job. But I do that, we old people do that, so you don't have to. And so what differs is younger people are going to be big. And they're not going to tolerate an environment that's just white or just well-meaning. The last thing I want to say in response to this beautiful question is we also have other choices. Something like 33%, Professor Mark Dollinger, who's in the room, would know better than I, of Jews in the West Coast are engaged, are affiliated, are technically connected to the Jewish community. So first of all, it's not as if the goal is to have everybody moved into engaged and affiliated communal space. That's an artifact of the past construct of the Jewish communal ecosystem, right? But what we want is all Jews to move fluidly through Jewish communal spaces, not only with ease, but with a sense of entitlement, right? Every Jew should feel entitled to our community. And it's really, really important that we understand that if we don't transform our predominantly white spaces, we can daven in each other's backyards, right? We can have Torah study on the farm, right? Because we're skilled and we're trained and we're informed as Jews and as Jewish communal leaders. And so the question is, what's keeping you all, the sort of metaphor you all, from keeping us out? Why keep us out when everything about who Jews of color are, we want in? And will only make this community stronger, smarter, more Jewish, better. And again, creating the capacity and the context for what we need for U.S. Judaism. The cost of not dealing with this is going to be the disintegration of U.S. Judaism, right? Because again, the proportion of population of Jews of color is only increasing. According to our study, according to Pew, every single day, it's called cohort replacement, each next group of Jewish babies born is more racially diverse than the day before. Our babies through 18, 20%, 22% are people of color. Every day that number gets bigger. So this is not like a theoretical exercise. The train has left the station. And if our environments are not racially diverse, then we are creating and fomenting segregated environments. And that's an artifact of our history we need not repeat. A couple more questions? Okay. Thank you, Aria. Oh, here's a question that we've not had before. What did disabled youth of color report regarding ableism and racism intersection? Thank you for whoever asked that question. No one's asked that one yet. If you go into the raw data, so you're not gonna, if you read, when you curl up with our 38 pages of data, you will not see a lot of discussion at the intersection of racism and ableism. So I just want to say that out loud. You would have to go into the raw data in that. And there might be a couple of narrative comments in the report that are not on this slide deck, because what's missing from this slide deck are all the beautiful narrative comments from many, many, many of the people who participated. But if you were to look at the raw data, the kind of big takeaway at the intersection is one of creating just a profound lack of access, and I don't use that term in a mobility way. The intersection of not being able to enter a space metaphorically, spiritually, or practically when one has an issue around being disabled, and also feels the headwinds of racism. Some of our participants also had an intersection around their queer identity. The multitude of those identities create such a profound lack of access for many Jews of color that the takeaway is one of being, and I used this word a couple of weeks with somebody else, being dispirited. Like just being dispirited when you cannot anymore because you can't get in. You can't get in physically, you can't get in racially, you can't get in spiritually. Maybe you didn't have access to a particular Jewish, strong, Torah Hebrew. And the headwinds become so great, and the physics of the wind becomes so exhausting that you just become tired. And that tired means you lose your spirit. And there were some indications of kind of the dispiriting at the intersection of those who self-identified as disabled and JOC, and again, some of them also identified as LGBTQ. So, yeah. Can we do one more, Aria? Okay. Is this data present in the Jewish communal master's or certificate programs around the country? You flatter us. This data actually is used in a number of Jewish communal studies departments. And I want to just raise up Professor Ari Y. Kelman, who's been a total ally and advocate and door kicker opener out there for us. And they've made a point of using this data in Jewish studies programs. So we've been to, meaning we are data. I'm going to personify the data. We've been to many colleges and universities where students are studying the data. And what I'll tell you is, and I've been to conservative environments, Orthodox environments, the young people are the future, full stop. Young people's minds are way more flexible and expansive than ours are. And many, many, many of the young people in the certificate or master's programs live in a world more diverse than ours. Right? They're already in an environment where they have a sibling, for example, who might be trans. Their cousins are people of color. Their parents are whatever. And they come to this work deeply grounded in their Jewish identity. Very clear if they're cisgender, if they're white, whatever it is, that they come with a lot of privilege. And so much more flexible around kind of moving through their identities and privilege and around the conversation. And so I'm so grateful that some of the studies, the master's studies and certificate programs have taken on the data. I mean, maybe I don't want to maybe say I'm more grateful, but I have profound gratitude to the professors and the educators out there who pedagogically expect young people to have flexible skills of thinking, who pedagogically demand critical thinking skills, who pedagogically demand young people know the truth, and with the truth, they can be engaged agents. Right? So the whole kind of pedagogical and philosophical container that's had with people in the master's and certificates programs, dare I say, is much more sophisticated in some ways than the conversations we've had with folks, let's say, 40 and older. And I would put myself in that group. So, but yeah, that's a really interesting question. Can I do one more?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, why don't we end on a hard one? What do we say to the white community member who was afraid that centering the experiences and voices of Jews of color will change their own experience, will change their own Ashkenormative experience, will change that their synagogue won't be recognizable anymore? Right? Which is such a real question, right? So what do we say? Here's what I say. And I'm curious, like, spiritually, what the other 200 of you all would say. So first of all, the reality is we do not know our own history. If you've not yet read We Once Were Slaves by Dr. Laura Liebman, there have been Jews of color in the United States or the territories or the land that was not ours, that we've stolen, since 1600s. The United States has actually had 10% Jews of color in it since the 1600s, and in the 1600s forward was largely Portuguese, it was largely Sephardic. But this book, We Once Were Slaves, talks about Sarah Moses and her family, who were like the presidents of Sheretz Israel in New York City, like in the 17 and 1800s. Okay? And so first of all, we have to help everyone understand, I guess I'll say it like that, we were lied to, right? Like we were lied to about who we are. And I personally would say then we have to give everybody, JOC, white people, an opportunity to sort of move through our feeling of being betrayed, right? Because what it's done is it's disabled all of us from being in relationship with each other, from collaborating together. And we've also lost the opportunity to talk about racism within a Jewish context, right? Like we have all these tools as Jews that we don't leverage in this conversation. And so what we say is, I'm sorry you were not told the truth. And let's study the truth together as a community. Do not leave this person alone. If they've shared this with you, they're reaching out for help. Like what a brave soul who might say that to somebody. That's an invitation for relationship. It's an invitation for learning. It's an invitation for a book club. You know what I'm saying? And then from there, once we all know the truth, we have to talk about the cost, right? Like, because you can't have an action plan unless you know what you've lost. And you can't process the grief unless you know what you've lost, right? I lost the opportunity to be in relationship with people. I lost the opportunity to walk through the streets of San Francisco as a child and see a person of color and assume they were Jewish. Because I was told, like, there are only 5 of you out of 2,000, that's it. Right? So we need to help people process the loss. And then, of course, if we were told that there were only white people, then it decenters and destabilizes people. It messes with our sense of power and authority. It messes with our idea of who can be in charge, who can be knowledgeable. And you can't just like shove that information into somebody. You have to create a conversation and a relationship to move that information between people. And then you got to figure out the action plan, right? And you cannot be compromising about responding to racism and white supremacy. Like there's no middle ground. There's no, we're going to be more tolerant. We're going to be more welcoming. You got to be like, we're going to be less racist. And then you have to anatomically understand how the racism plays in your community. You got to be rigorous about understanding its impact. So you got to like have a research eye and an accountability tool. And then you have to allocate resources to affect change. And I'll end by saying, this question poses like, well, you have to like kind of move some of us out of the way to make room for more Jews of color. First, I'm going to say no. Like if you got more people inside a synagogue, that's a good day, right? No one's going to move anybody out of the way when you have dwindling synagogue affiliation, right? Like that's not going to be the answer. Will you have to repoint cash resources? For example, you're dealing with your annual budget, and for the last 100 years, you've neglected Jews of color. You systematically neglected Jews of color. Yeah, you're going to have to repoint your resources. And that's a hard conversation to have, but that's the conversation to have. And we do it in the context of strong leadership compassionate leadership, we also have to be real that there's not a paucity of resources in the Jewish communal space. There's a paucity of courage, right? There's a paucity of choosing to reallocate power. And the only antidote to that is being a leader in community with others. And that's a leader with a big L, a leader with a little l. That's like our daily interactions. That's every choice we make. And that's what we call community. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you. All right. Without further ado, I want to introduce or reintroduce my colleague Aria Marvazi. I just want to say, Aria, you have done a beautiful job holding and creating a program space for the Jews of Color Initiative. Aria and Tanda have been with us since January. And I just want to flag for everybody, this work also has to be done with a lot of heart. It requires a wicked intellect, don't get me wrong, but it requires as much a sensitive heart. And what Aria has brought to the JOCI is kind of that incredible balance of brilliance and heart. And I just want to affirm that and appreciate that anyway.
Thank you so much, Ilana, and thank you everyone online and in person for your questions. I'm very excited about this next piece. We're going to be hearing from 3 inspiring Bay Area Jewish leaders of color, each of whom are also friends and colleagues, and so that's just exciting. I'm going to quickly introduce their names and titles before having them join us up on our little stage over here. We have Lindsay Newman, board member and Racial Justice Task Force co-chair with our partners here at the Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund, and also director of community engagement at Bechol Lashon. We have Ana Lucia Lopez Revoredo, founder and executive director of Jutina, and senior director of Project Shamash. Grateful to have some of the participants from their JOC professional network here with us today in the room. And Maya Katzali, Northern California field manager at One Table and a community representative of Lunar as well. Please join me on our little panel. Maybe I'll come here a bit, just so I can see you well. So by way of introduction, I'm going to invite you each to share a bit about just your own leadership within JOC community. And then I know that each of you, Lindsay, Ana Lucia, and Maya, have seen this research before. But given today's presentation, what are some of the visceral reactions that arise? I'll start with Ana Lucia right here to my right and move over to Maya.
Great, thank you. First and foremost, it's such an honor to be here with all of you and to be able to be reinvigorated by the data. My name is Ana Lucia Lopez Revoredo, and I have been working in the Jewish communal space since 2014. I don't really like using the term accidental. I think I was very much meant to be here, but it wasn't what I had originally envisioned. And almost the entire time, there has been I won't say a special focus, but a real dedication to lifting up voices that have been historically on the periphery of the way in which we think about American Jewish life. So I started working with Jimena, and then I worked at One Table for 4 years, my goodness. And now working with Ben the Ark and Jutina Iko, I've been able to see just how much the Jewish community needs the conversations that are taking place right now. I think when it comes to visceral reactions, there's no surprise to me just what's been going on, what has been happening for folks. There's nothing that surprises me, but there is something that invigorates me, as I mentioned earlier, around what are we doing today? We're here, we're talking about this, and we talk a lot about belonging, but how do we talk more about being anti-racist? So just like we, especially here in the Bay Area, we have such a beautiful focus on those cultures of belonging. What are those cultures of anti-racism that we create so that we can really address what we're seeing here? And that's kind of the reaction that I'm getting to everything at this moment in time.
That's beautiful. I welcome you all to, of course, just casually respond to one another's responses as well as we have our conversation. Lindsay.
Yes. Again, reiterate what a pleasure it is to be here and be up here with my esteemed colleagues and friends. And, part of what makes this so joyful is hearing the stories of each other and hearing my experience reflected. So I think I had a lot of what you just said, Ana Lucia, resonates with me. Personally, I became involved in Jews of color community as a young adult, a teenager, really, in the early 2000s, connecting with other Jews of color, both informally, formally through, at that point, the Jewish Multiracial Network was sort of like my first into finding, oh, there are lots of other Jews of color out there, and people want to make community. And with the rise of social media, and the internet, access to the internet, there were so many more ways to connect with people. And so, as entering young adulthood, I found more often that engaging with Jewish community, which was a community that I grew up in, I always felt very connected to that identity and that community. But as I grew into a young adult, feeling that, I was feeling maybe more uncomfortable by people's questions, or feeling that, I was getting tired of having to field those questions in most of the Jewish spaces I walked into that happened to be predominantly white. And so it was really at that point where I just happened to realize that, yeah, the Jewish spaces that I was opting into were Jew of color spaces. And that's where I felt connection, that's where I felt joy, that's where I felt that there was this vibrancy. And then also in 2014 is when I was able to do that and build that community as a professional, as a Jewish communal professional. So I sort of feel like I dropped out of as a child, I was very engaged in, traditional communal life, then kind of dropped out of that, of the traditional Jewish communal life as a young adult, and then sort of became an insider again by becoming a Jewish communal professional. And so it's been a great joy that I can, do that work that I love and grow as a professional in that, and continue to build other spaces and organizations that really serve that need. And so that is part of the work that I do at B'chol Lashon, which is an organization that focuses on advocating for that racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse Jewish community.
Right.
And so, one of the things that is really resonating with me right now after hearing and working together for the last hour is really that piece of that perspectives that, because I think it's very clear that our understanding of ourselves as a community is achieved by the questions that we ask about ourselves. And the questions we ask about ourselves depend on what perspective we have. And so it's incredible to have not just more diverse populations of people engaging in community, but more diverse voices who are allowing their perspective to influence what questions we ask about ourselves, what work are we lifting up and prioritizing as a community. And B'chol Lashon actually even started as a research institute that we, 20 years ago almost, it just started with that question of what is the racial diversity of the Jewish community? And we began with a study that was actually, at that time, created by white Jews who had children of color who were saying, well, now we're in a multiracial family, we need to find out what other Jews of color are out there. And since then, 20 years later, we have more and more research coming out that's giving more nuance to who we are as a community, that's asking different questions to really bring out that vibrancy. So it's really great to continue that journey.
Thank you for sharing the arc, and thank you for continuing to expand that leadership today, Lindsay. Maya.
Yeah, hi, my name is Maya, and I am born and raised actually in Oakland, California, so this is my place of home. I left to go to university out in Boston, Massachusetts, and came right back. I always say it was because of the cold weather, but also it really was, I grew up in a multicultural family. That's what we grew up calling it, and I think I really learned about the term Jews of color when I returned here after university, which I'll go into more later. But I think that when coming back, was looking for community and looking for where I fit in and what felt like home. outside of my family and outside of my actual home. And I found Bechol Lashon, and I was at Bechol Lashon for about a year, and I got to learn a lot about like global Jewish communities, and that felt really wonderful to me, and kind of just following any curiosities I'd had. I travel a good amount, and I'm just interested in how people kind of marry their identities and how it looks in different cultural contexts, and so I could kind of pick and choose what felt good for me to be expressing myself and looking for my own community. And I think that there's so much I could share. I'm at one table right now, and now I almost see it as a trajectory of like, at Bechol Lashon, I was learning, I was absorbing, I was studying, I was researching, and getting to be amidst a lot of people that were interested in similar things. At one table, I've been given kind of the green light to experiment and go, and just go forth and bring community together that I find really meaningful. I think I was really emboldened and supported by Jews of color in the Bay Area after attending Shabbats with Becca, who's in our audience here, and wonderful other people. And that really kind of helped to shape what I see as like important to my identity, but then also I was seeing that echoed in my community, that I was not the only one searching. And so through One Table, I've gotten the really wonderful chance to meet and work with all of you and so many more people, and really kind of give a stage to Jews of color that I was seeing highly skilled in some areas or wanting to share some sorts of events or Shabbat-related things and pull community together around that. And that's really been such an incredible experience of just discovery and expression. And what I would say is, from just sitting here in the audience and kind of absorbing the information today, I really loved just the continual affirmation. I think just seeing that there are so many other people experiencing, thinking, feeling the things that maybe I have felt or my friends and colleagues have felt, that actually, I feel, gives us a lot of courage to dig deeper and say, okay, if I'm not the only one feeling this, or if I see that somebody else is experiencing this thing and I haven't really thought about it in this way, what's beneath that? What are the roots, and how can we take an anti-racist approach to really supporting ourselves and each other in this work and going forward in what we dream to see in our community?
Amen. I find that so much of what all of us do is about creating pathways that would have made our youth and our experiences that much more enriched in Jewish life in ways that young adults now get to experience because people like you are at the helm. I wanna ask, and naturally we could probably talk for 3 hours, and we have something around 15 minutes, so we'll just ask a couple tight questions. But with the imperfect term Jews of color, we know that it still certainly holds weight in meaning. I'm curious, what does it mean to you to identify as a Jew of color, and what do you see as the evolution of this collective identity? In any which way, communally speaking, for you and your family, however you think about that. We'll start on that end maybe with Maya.
Sure, yeah. I just left off at that point almost anyways.
Yeah, it's a perfect transition.
So yeah, as I said, I was born and raised in Oakland, California, to a very multicultural family, in the sense that I just thought that was the norm. My dad's from India, my mom's of European descent, my dad's Muslim, my mom's Jewish, and that's normal. And people would ask me questions, and I, would explain a little bit, but when I was in the Bay Area, it's that was boring. Everybody else was also of different backgrounds, and so I think when I left, that's when I was pushed to really define myself, because I was no longer just a fish in water. I was now kind of on my own, being faced with those kinds of questions and not having any reference points. And I think that really pushed me to think about, okay, how do I want to express this identity? I went to Clark University, which I was lucky was very international, and that was incredible. I could go to celebrations of Indian holidays and things like this, also a really strong Jewish life. So I was kind of swimming back and forth, going between the different things that I felt comfortable in. And then I came home and I said, okay, where do multicultural Jews go now? And I went straight to Alana Kaufman, not really knowing who she was, emailed her cold email and said, it looks like you're doing incredible work. Can we get coffee? And I was so lucky and now honored that we had coffee for about 2 hours as it goes, and I learned all about just the layout of the land over here. And multicultural Jews were now, or could be called, Jews of color. And I was like, whoa, okay, that's a whole new term, whole new community. And I dove right in and met so many wonderful people that I'm looking at just now. And I think that that's been kind of my own evolution of what that means to me. But then also thinking about it kind of in a larger sense, I think that identity is really a journey, right? It's changing all the time, how the world is identifying us, how we're identifying ourselves, these kinds of things. And as we saw in the research, we're just increasing in diversity. We're increasing in, multicultural, multiracial, 2+ racial identities for people. And that's, I think, going to be part of how we now look at each other. So hopefully it won't be like, oh, what's your, what are you? How the question might be asked of some people, but more like, who are you? And already accepting the fact that there's probably 17 different racial mixes within each individual person, and do we have to dive into that? You can, and you can lead with curiosity, or you can just take things at face value and ask questions about who that person is.
That's beautiful. I mean, I constantly think, and Alana referenced it, this piece that we're not having a hypothetical conversation about some future that may be, but that it is an objective fact that globalization makes it such that we are trending towards a multiracial future, and the Jewish world is going to be responding to that, well, strategically, thoughtfully, in advance, or not. And I'm glad that the conversation in this room has us doing some of that thinking together. Lindsay, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, the notion, as you said, that Jews of color is an imperfect term. I think that's true. I also think of it as a term with a lot of value, though it is imperfect. I think of it as an expansive term that's constantly being defined and redefined and is in conversation with how we define race and ethnicity and identity in general and in this country. And I see it, I see most of the value, as Alana mentioned in her presentation or work, was that, Jews of color, it helps to define an experience, and an experience that's often impacted by marginalization, not defined by marginalization, but impacted by marginalization. And it is a term for me that where most of the value comes from is that it's a term that can help us create community and gives us a rallying point for people who might share both background, legacy, and experience.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's beautiful. Thank you, Lindsay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, echoing both of what Maya and Lindsay just shared, I think just to add to it, for me, when I hear, in terms of the term Jew of color, yes, it is imperfect, but there's also so much question and curiosity that comes from it, which is, to me, something that is also important. Because if people are curious enough to say, Jews of color, tell me a little bit more about that term, it's not necessarily always the person of color's need to kind of go into a whole history of it, but there's an opportunity to just kind of like, to think a little bit of, there is certain divides that exist within the Jewish community that whether or not I've been aware of, they have existed and they've been impacting communities. There is an opportunity to think about power. There is an opportunity to think about whiteness, as we mentioned earlier. And yes, if we use the term Jew of color, we are by default admitting that there is whiteness that exists, or at least that there's power that comes with whiteness, right? And so I think that all of those, that critical experience that needs to be taking place within the Jewish community is an important way in which to look at the experience. And that's kind of like in its simplest, more like critical format. But I also see it as an opportunity around double consciousness. And when you're looking at the report for Beyond the Count, you're able to see a little bit more about the term. And that feeling of double consciousness is something that just can't be shaken. Because when you're walking into a space, I'm not just thinking about how are people going to react to me being a Jew. I'm also needing to think about how are people or society going to react to me being Latina, to me being an immigrant, to me being a child of parents who don't really speak English that well. So there is this like level of like this tenseness that sometimes we walk around with a little bit more, and that can feel a little bit different for folks, depending on a wide range of other things. But I think it's important to note that it allows us to think that there are different experiences in the room, and that we can't flatten them. So it inspires us to unflatten the experience of Jews that are a multicultural people.
Can I add just one
By all
short thing?
means.
Absolutely. And I think to add to that notion that this is a living term, and to call into this room that there have been a lot of JOCs who've written about that and
Right.
put work out there that delves into that. So I encourage people to seek that out. And just in particular, there's been writing by Shahana McKinney-Baldwin that dissects sort of both the history of the actual term Jew of color, and what that means and where that might be going.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Amen.
And even just since the study was released, one of the questions I hear all the time is, how does this term exist with relationship to white supremacy, where the white supremacist is suggesting none of you are, white. You are all people that are not specifically non-white, and we're talking about a racialized experience in an American context, and this is about our self-identification, has no relationship to how you all, think about us, act on us, and so our community should not, be convinced to think in that headspace or mind space either. I'm going to wrap it up with that question that came about, that is about the Bay Area and your JOC experience in the Bay Area. I'm curious how it has been unique for you, in particular, given each of you have lived in other places and have experienced JOC community and Jewish life in other spaces as well. And this also just relates to the Jews of Color Initiative and our work right now. One of the things that we're doing is a community scan of the Bay Area to understand what are the right programmatic and or other offerings that are going to help serve Jews of color in this region. So I'm just curious, what are your unique experiences here that may be different than Jewish life compared to other parts of the country? Lindsay, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, and I know we're wrapping up our time, so I'll try to be as succinct as possible. I think, the big thing that I noticed because I grew up and I'm a native New York Jew and came to the Bay Area, first time living in California 8 years ago, and I noticed that Jewish life here, which felt distinct to me, was a little less centered on institutional life, that there was still vibrant institutional life here, but that Jews on the West Coast sort of took on that sort of pioneer spirit almost, and people were much more comfortable creating their own Jewish community and their own Jewish practice in a way that was meaningful to them. And there was not a lot of needing to have the validation from institutional life. And I think that's reflected in the JOC experience and community that exists here too, that there's a lot of different pockets of JOC organizing and community and practice all over the Bay Area that spans both geography, spans Jewish background, experience, practice, and so there are a lot of different ways to find other Jews of color to create that space with.
Amen. Maya.
I really have to build on what Lindsay is saying over here. That's what I wrote down in my notes as well. But really, just like the idea that Judaism can be more personal feels like the water that we're swimming in the Bay Area, where people are kind of discovering for themselves what does Judaism mean and expressing that. And I think that feels very unique to the Bay Area, just in the way that we kind of don't follow institutional ways of practicing, but then also I think that means that ritual is feeling very live in a way, like it's moving and changing, and people are kind of discovering their own rituals within Judaism or something that's adjacent that feels authentic to their Jewish identity and bringing that in. And I think that goes along with the idea that in the Bay Area, it feels like we're very intersectional in a lot of ways, in the ways of like Lunar, the Jewish Asian film project that was kind of born in the Bay Area. That feels very like of course it was born in the Bay Area. We're really interested in kind of where do we lie at these intersections, and how can we bring that to life, not only for ourselves, but then for our local community, and not necessarily having to make it institutionalized. I think that's what I would say, building on what Lizzie said.
It's beautiful. Worthy of mention that Lunar was just in the JOCI incubator in New York and is expanding chapters in their work across the West Coast even further. So it's amazing.
Absolutely.
Ana Lucia.
I just want to, in hearing them talk, I was thinking a lot about what makes the Bay Area so unique. I think there's a number of pieces that make we're a collective environment. There's people here who are wearing masks, and a lot of places in the world wouldn't be, and that's because people care about how the community is going to be impacted by their particular choices. And I think that's something very unique in the Bay, and that's something that also allows for so much curiosity and innovation to be born in the Bay Area. The reason why we see so many projects come out of here is because we're continuously encouraged to dream bigger than what has ever been done before. And I think that it's interesting because I'm continuously in conversations with a wide range of people. And people will say, well, it's great that you're doing these projects and so on and so forth. And how are you going to get the folks that you're serving to join Jewish community? And I have to kind of stop it right there because I say, this is Jewish community. We are in Jewish community. And all throughout the Bay Area, you just see how Jewish community is alive. And it doesn't have to be in a space that has the place where our grandparents, great-grandparents found space. And I think that it's important for us to just remember that we are who we are because we've continuously been supporting one another to think outside of the box, outside of the wall, to embody Judaism, to find joy in Judaism, because we're not just doing things because we're told to do them. We're doing them because they bring us to life. And I think that that's what makes the Bay Area unique.
Amen. I'm hearing like the theme of decentralizing and diversifying Jewish life. And if that's not what we're all doing, we're doing something wrong. Thank you three so very much for your time, for your leadership, for the ways that you each and all contribute to the vibrancy of Jewish life in so many ways. And this brings us to the close of our program. I want to just say a few words of gratitude to our partners at the Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund, Joyce Sisiski, Daniel Mersher, Rachel Kaber out there online for all your help in bringing the virtual experience to life. Rather than listing off names, I'll just say the entire JOCI team, the Jews of Color Initiative team, thank you for all you did to bring this to life. We have a new teammate, Jade Grubman, who is our program associate in New York. Hello out there, and thank you for all your efforts. And to the Rodan Family Foundation and your leadership, we appreciate your support of all of these efforts. Inspiring panelists, attendees, and everyone else committed to a future where Jewish life and leadership reflects our most beautiful diversity. Thank you again, onward and upward together. Our gratitude.
LA.
Good times. Yeah, we can all hug it out now. Thank you for being with us, everyone.